The lights are dimmed, candles are lit, bodies begin to sway together as the voice from the stage recites a mantra.
You will get there if you do not give up. Don't forget that. Up.
Group fitness classes have, for many, become something more than just a good way to get their blood pumping and their pounds dropping.
They come for the body, but they stay for the community.
On this episode of How God Works, we're going to take a look at why exercise classes from Soul-cycle to Crossfit have become some of the most fervent venues for secular spirituality.
There's a real culture of kind of ethical commitment, right? So another phrase you'll hear a lot is the way you show up in the gym is the way you show up in life.
But Soul-cycle didn't invent this winning formula. Combining spirit and body is nothing new.
Neshama is the Hebrew word for both breath and soul, which is why I chose it for this workout worship. The whole idea is that we need both to be fully human.
We'll hear how more traditional faiths are starting to discover, or should I say rediscover, the idea of sweaty spiritualism, and how pushing ourselves to new limits with physical activity taps into age-old traditions of embodied practices, ones that use the body to change what we feel, how we connect, and what we believe.
Our breath animates our soul, and without a soul, we really wouldn't be human.
And we'll learn some of the science behind why sweating together brings us closer together.
Endorphin-releasing activities can give like a higher high when they're performed socially as compared to when they're performed alone.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. Casper ter Kuile is an expert on bridging spirituality and community. He's the author of the book, The Power of Ritual, and has written a good deal about the emerging trend of secular spiritualism, a trend where young people are looking for aspects of religion outside of faith institutions, ways to become better versions of themselves by connecting with each other, with nature, and even with something bigger. Casper calls these desires the 3 B's: belonging, becoming, and beyond. And according to Casper's research, one place people are getting all these needs met: exercise classes.
One of the big things that you experience in a workout space is, of course, that sense of becoming. And it might be really simple. I want to lose weight. I want to gain muscle. There's some sense of personal growth that's there. Now, that's the first level. But really, what we've heard over and over again, and CrossFit is a place that I've spent a lot of time kind of studying, is people say they come for the body, but they stay for the community. That's not true for everyone, but for a significant percentage, the CrossFit gym becomes one of the central community locations in participants' lives. So this is where, we've literally seen weddings and funerals hosted at CrossFits, people's going away barbecues. This is where they'll do a stand-up comedy night with friends, or someone picks up the cello again for the first time in years. And so, they meet their roommates, their partners, their friends in this workout. And it's partly because some of these workouts are specifically designed to be social. So rather than showing up at a normal gym, you've got your headphones in, you're doing your own thing, kind of solo player. A lot of CrossFit's workouts are really group-based. And so you're meeting people, you're building relationships. And even things like the CrossFit Games, this annual gathering where athletes compete from around the world, there was this sense of kind of pilgrims gathering together from across the lands to come together. And so that's a way in which a community gets to see the bigger community that it's part of. And you get to cheer for your particular team and your athlete, amongst the bigger crowd. So they were definitely intentional about cultivating that kind of relational connection.
In things like Soul-cycle, there does seem to be I will admit, I don't spin. Hell, I don't even exercise very much. I sit and do a podcast, and as a professor,
you exercise your mind.
I exercise
Dave.
my mind.
Exactly.
Yes, I have large contours in my mental gyree, but yeah, my biceps are not. But it seems to me from the outside that there actually are some intentional kind of spiritual elements being woven in now. So you've talked about the becoming, we're kind of showing up and committing to our goal, and we're belonging in the community. Do you think that there actually is, in some of these programs, are they incorporating that desire to touch the beyond?
100%. I mean, with SoulCycle, the clue is in the name.
Yes.
It's really hidden in plain sight. And the research that we did, we went to a number of classes, and one of them featured a woman, because their elite instructors don't sit on the bike. They'll have some kind of cute, hunky guy often sitting in the bike, and they will walk around and frankly preach. So we went to one class in California, and this woman was an astonishing speaker. And, she was saying things like, keep going, there are angels clapping for you in heaven. And we asked her at the end, where did you learn to do this? And she said, well, I went to Oral Roberts undergrad, this famous evangelical college. And so the thing that she was very intentional about was keeping the language very open, very vague about what exactly this beyond or spiritual something was.
Right, not tied to a specific dogma.
Exactly. It wasn't saying like you have to believe this, but there was certainly an invitation to look beyond your own context and the everyday to something perhaps eternal. Now that varies from place to place. Another example might be, we went to another class where a woman was essentially eulogizing her father-in-law who had just died. And by her music choices, she was remembering who he was and telling us stories about him and why he was so important and what kind of life he lived. And so there was inherently this sense of transcendence that she was evoking in commemorating this man who had just died.
So you're an expert on the power of ritual. What ritualistic elements do you see them incorporating? Because one of the big questions that I have in looking at this is there are lots of clubs and people come together in lots of clubs, but not all of them begin to take on this level of commitment, zeal, and for some kind of spiritual side. So putting on your anthropological lens, what goes on in some of these sessions that reminds you of religious ritual?
Well, SoulCycle is really an excellent example, in part because it has such a liturgical design, by which I mean they have 45 minutes in which you're on that bike seat, and they very intentionally take you through different stages of your own experience. So they design it as a sort of emotional journey that you're going to go through in those 45 minutes. And they use, just like you might in a worship service, a lot of kind of sensual tools and clues. So, for example, the lights go very dark. There's sort of fake candlelight on the altar, the raised cycling instructor's stage area. There's extremely loud music, so your senses are kind of overwhelmed, just like it might be with incense or stained glass windows. And of course, then there's the physical movement. There's the sense that you're not just cycling by yourself, but they talk about you're part of a pack. And so there's a choreography to the movements, just like there might be in a prayer sequence, where you lose that sense of kind of individuality and melt into a larger whole. And so if you look at it from that sense, you really start to see a sort of architecture of experience. And secular folks might call that experience design. Religious leaders might call it liturgical design. But there's a real desire, not just for you to have a good workout and sweat and burn calories, but for you to have an emotional arc that leads to a sort of cathartic release. And so the penultimate song, often in a SoulCycle class, is called The Hill Climb, where you turn up the resistance dial on the bike. So it becomes really tough to kind of push through. And what this does is that it absolutely pushes your emotions open and everyone cries. That's kind of the joke. And so
it sounds like a Pentecostal service. I don't know.
Absolutely. All we're missing is the speaking in tongues.
Yes. The hill climb Casper mentioned isn't just a good way to burn more calories at the end. It's also a design feature. It works on our minds, not just our muscles.
That's the thing about physical activity. It's not just physical activity, right? It's cognitive, it's emotional, it's very often social, and maybe sometimes spiritual.
Emma Cohen is a cognitive anthropologist at Oxford who, for years, has been studying the links between exercise and social connection. We've talked a lot on this show about how things like synchrony, think pedaling bikes together, can make people feel closer. But Emma's work goes beyond that. For her, it's not just moving together in time that matters. It's also how much effort we put into it. How blood, sweat, and tears, sometimes literally, can create feelings of connection, pleasure, and sometimes even a tiny bit of mystical ecstasy.
You do come across just a huge amount of sporting anecdote that links very heightened, embodied, visceral experiences that take place in a social context to what people would maybe describe as the sacred or the spiritual. And there's one example comes to mind. Daniel James Brown has written a fantastic book called The Boys in the Boat. And it's about a very underdog US rowing 8 that made it to the 1936 Olympics in Hitler's Germany. So a very kind of against the odds story. But there's some wonderful descriptions in there of sort of mystical, I think they describe as mystical bonds of trust and affection that lift the crew out of the ordinary sphere. And they talk about this turns pain and effort to ecstasy. They talk about effort is replaced by ecstasy.
Where simple synchrony of movement can kind of make people feel part of a larger whole, this added element of exertion, whether it be marching for hours in a pilgrimage or rowing together in a race, releases a natural elixir into our bloodstreams that gets right to work on our brains. One ingredient is endorphins, the pain-reducing chemicals that cause the runner's high. But another important ingredient is something called endocannabinoids. That's right, chemicals that target the same receptors as cannabis. But here, the goal's not to get high. These chemicals have a different purpose.
So these endocannabinoids are thought to play a role in social bonding. So putting these together, we proposed that perhaps moderate intensity exercise in a social setting compared with low intensity exercise could contribute to social bonding. We found it in rowers and also in, as it happens, Brazilian school kids in a kind of dance setup. We taught them some moves and then they performed them to music standing up versus sitting down. And after the moderate intensity condition, we saw that they felt more bonded to those that they had been dancing with.
So Emma's work showed that increased exertion can make us feel more bonded to the people around us. But she didn't stop there. She wondered whether there was something about this bonding as a group that then feeds back into how people perform when they exercise.
The other side of what we're researching more and more now is how social bonding and social support and perceptions of being supported by others can influence the sort of psychophysiology of fatigue and effort. So feelings of fatigue and perhaps pain are fundamentally altered in a socially supportive context.
In other words, there's a bit of a feedback loop that pushes a group to work harder and helps connect them more deeply with each other.
I began to wonder whether endorphin-releasing activities can give like a higher high when they're performed socially as compared to when they're performed alone. You know, when you hear people describing what happens in a rowing 8 in particular, when it just works, and that means every sinew, muscle, joint is pulling together. Synchrony is so crucial to boat velocity that's something that they just practice and practice and practice, apart from just the grind and endurance. So they talk about the boat sort of just, it starts to sing. There's this huge lift when it all just comes together and it starts to go that bit faster. So I think there is really something phenomenologically about rowing, but certainly that sense of pulling together all at the same time, and your efforts blend into the efforts of the one person next to you. Can't really distinguish between. All of that must be part of that sort of sense of social bonding.
We know synchrony does this, but how about when the level of exertion ramps up? Emma knew that research on endorphins showed that people's pain tolerance goes up with more intense exercise, but she wondered if it would go up even more when people exercise together. She decided to test this out by measuring how people's tolerance for pain increased when they rowed alone versus when they rowed in a group.
So, as predicted, it did go up in the solo condition significantly, but there was a threefold increase again. So 3 times the increase occurred in that pain threshold in the social condition versus the solo condition. So there was something about being in that group or social context that influenced pain threshold.
So even without the rewards of winning a gold medal or even crossing a finish line at all, when rowers worked harder together, they felt closer to one another. And here's the important part. They felt something beyond just happy or pleasant when it was all over.
It's not necessarily just happiness, positive emotion that occurs potentially maybe after the painful event has subsided, but perhaps something more on the spectrum of euphoria. It's more of a calm happiness, positive emotion. So that's what's being described, I think, for many people engaging in exercise. We do know there was something about the group contributing to this. This kind of activity can really take us out of the sort of everyday humdrum. Like, our lives are very comfortable, contained. Most of my life is in front of a screen. And when people come together, there is this kind of high level of stimulation, even in the fact of assembly. And when we talk about the importance of the fact that this intervention is social, people tend to think of that as just, oh, it's the fun bit. But actually, it is fun, but it's just so much more than that. Being connected to something and others means that you're engaging in something that is much larger than the self.
That brings us back to the becoming, belonging, and beyond that Casper mentioned. Emma's work shows that using our bodies, exerting ourselves, can be a kind of spiritual technology of sorts. We're not eating magic mushrooms or smoking cannabis to put chemicals in our body. The exertion is making our bodies manufacture their own mind-altering substances, ones that, in the right context, can make us feel spiritual. And this point about context brings us back to SoulCycle. I asked Casper if he thought the originators kind of stumbled on a formula that worked, or if they were intentional about adding a bit of spiritual design.
I would say there was definitely intentionality about helping people have something that felt spiritual. And I should offer a disclaimer. I've come to know the founders a little bit, so I've had a little bit more insight into that founding story. But they were certainly intentional about that spiritual piece. I would say less so wanting to copy or kind of extract religious stuff. Just like a designer at Disney is creating an experience, they're going to be drawing on all sorts of different influences. I'd say SoulCycle was the same. But what I do think is interesting is that for people participating in experiences like this, often there isn't an awareness of what's happening. And there's kind of like, wow, why am I crying? Why was this so beautiful? Why was this so intense? There's something that has a hold on them that isn't just about the workout.
Movement and exertion builds connections with others, allows us to commit to and reach goals, even releasing endorphins that help keep us going. But fitness classes and sports teams didn't discover this. It's something religions all over the world have known and used for centuries. Many Eastern religions use practices like yoga to help people cultivate the spiritual. In Western religions, you sometimes see it in things like Christian pilgrimages or Sufi dancing. In Judaism, it was often a little tamer.
There's a long history of standing and sitting and bowing at certain times during prayers. There's also a shorter history, but a significant history of chanting and dancing.
But Rabbi Jaymee Alpert decided to kick it up a notch, to bridge exercise and Jewish spirituality. An idea that came to her about 10 years ago when she read an article about a walking therapist.
She found that people opened up more deeply when they were moving their bodies, and they also had breakthroughs more quickly. And I started wondering if it worked for therapy, what would it mean for prayer? And so I spoke with my personal trainer, Fernando Martinez, and asked him the question. And he said, I don't know, let's explore it. And so we really started to think about adding prayer into workouts and vice versa to see what would happen. And that was the whole premise of Neshama Body and Soul.
The name was a perfect fit.
Neshama is the Hebrew word for both breath and soul, which is why I chose it for this workout worship. The whole idea is that we need both to be fully human. Our breath animates our soul, and without a soul, we really wouldn't be human.
That's interesting. I had no idea that it means the same thing. Is there, oftentimes when we talk about breath and soul or spiritual development, it makes me, and I'm sure a lot of other people, think of meditation or contemplative exercises. But this is kind of quite the opposite in some senses, right?
It really is. And I appreciate that Neshama Body and Soul asks people to do two really difficult things at the same time. So on the one hand, I'm asking people to pray. And on the other hand, or really at the same time, I'm also asking people to exercise, one at a time is challenging enough for most people, but to ask people to do both, I know it can be difficult, but I think there's something really significant about pushing ourselves. I think when we push ourselves spiritually, we often come to places we didn't know we could reach. And when we push ourselves physically, I've often found the same to be true.
Like Emma said, the pushing ourselves, the exerting ourselves together, brings an added element. And in a context with a little religion sprinkled in, Jaymee says that added element can deepen spirituality.
Sometimes I work out just to work out, and I'm there to exercise, and I'm not really thinking about praying except, oh God, give me the strength to keep doing this, right? And other times I'm praying as my own prayer practice. But there is something about connecting the two that I think makes us more aware and appreciative of what our bodies can do, what our breath can do, and how the body informs the mind and vice versa. I try to make the Neshama workouts manageable for people. The idea is that this should enhance your prayer experience, and the prayer experience should enhance your exercise experience, but it's not meant to be your hardest workout of the week. Although for some people, sometimes it is. But the idea is to really combine our bodies and our spirits, or our bodies and our soul. So often I find that we're bifurcated, right? We're either at the gym working out, or we're in a house of worship praying, or we could be at the office, or we could be in the kitchen making breakfast, whatever it is. But we're usually kind of singularly focused. And Neshama invites people to bring their whole selves into the space. And so we're really praying with our whole bodies.
And is there something about doing it together, right, as opposed to on your exercise bike at home?
I think so. It builds a sense of community. I've noticed over the years that it's also really helpful for people to be in an exercise space with other people, that we can be supportive of one another. I would say the same thing for prayer space, and Jewish prayer by and large is very much community oriented. So it makes sense to me that this would also take place in community, that we'd be moving our bodies and we would be singing prayers at the same time in the same place together, and that it becomes a shared experience.
It's this community through physicality that has prompted other religions to rediscover embodied worship. More and more explicitly religious fitness groups are springing up around the country. There's something called Soulcore that combines Catholic prayer with strength exercising and stretching. There's also something called Faith RxD, whose stated goal is to strengthen faith through fitness. But as Jaymee says, you don't need a fancy gym full of expensive equipment to do any of this.
There's really no equipment beyond our bodies. And I think there's something really powerful about that as well, that weights and other equipment and exercise bikes are fantastic, but sometimes we can just rely on our own selves to move our bodies and give ourselves a good workout.
But like the others, there's also a good deal of traditional religion added in.
We'll often start with a traditional blessing. It's called Asher Yatzar, and it's about 2,000 years old. And it goes back to the Talmud, and it was a way for the ancient rabbis to thank God for making the human body so incredible, and that it has arteries and organs, and that everything needs to be working in order for us to be able to fully serve God. And what I think is so interesting is that this blessing is very much thanking God for our bodies, and at the same time is spiritual. And in fact, people who are very traditionally Jewish observant will recite this prayer after they use the bathroom. So it is very much a physical prayer, and there's a spiritual component. So after we recite this prayer or another prayer to sort of set the tone for our time together, we'll start moving our bodies. We'll do some warm-ups, some jumping jacks or mountain climbers, and then we'll recite another prayer. I like to make the connection between what we're physically doing and what might be going on for us spiritually. So I think a lot about the words that we use to describe spiritual states, and a lot of them are also physical states, right? We use words like strength and flexibility and resilience. And we think of them in terms of how we live our lives. We want to build our resiliency. We want to have strong core values. And when we're holding a plank, we're also building a strong physical core. So I like to make those connections for people. And then there are also some guided meditations as well, based on what might be happening on the Jewish calendar, what kind of scripture we're reading, some just opportunities for inward reflection. I like to offer those guided meditations as a lead-in to holding plank, so that while people are propping themselves up on their toes and on their forearms, they have something to think about besides, please don't let me fall and break my teeth.
So would you say what you do is strength training? And if so, why strength training as opposed to, as you said before, just walking?
I do take people hiking, and I connect prayer to the hikes. We go on Shabbat morning, the Jewish Sabbath, as an alternative to a much more traditional sanctuary service. But for Neshama, it just felt like, how do we really get into our bodies? And how do we really make that connection to prayer? And I'll be honest, it's not necessarily a natural fit, and it definitely takes some getting used to. But there's something so powerful about doing a squat, for instance, and feeling the floor underneath our feet, and also thinking about what grounds us in our life. So that's why body weight strength training was so important to me. And again, there's something powerful about using our bodies, celebrating them, what we can do, acknowledging what we can't do or what we can't yet do, and then also pushing ourselves just a little bit harder than we thought we might be able to without injury.
Combining a physical and spiritual practice wasn't always a priority for Jaymee, though. In fact, physical activity was something she avoided.
As a kid, I was the last picked for everything. And I came up with more excuses to sit out of gym class than I think is humanly possible. I mean, really, every excuse, faked injury, whatever it was, that was me.
That was me too. One of my favorite memories from elementary school is the day I got picked second to last for the kickball team.
That's a big accomplishment. Yeah. And I totally get it. Right. And there's still that kid inside of me who says, this is like, how is this even possible?
But in adulthood, she got more and more into fitness and eventually tried a Soul Cycle class. Her reaction, though, was mixed.
So when I went just for myself, just as Jaymee, to get in a good spin class, I thought, I don't really need the candles and the hands to heart center. It's not my thing. Like, just take me through a good workout. When I went sort of with my rabbi hat on, with curiosity to see, because it was really, really speaking to the masses at the time that I went to those classes, I thought, it's so interesting, right? It's just so interesting what's happening here, because it is that sort of universal spirituality, and set an intention for yourself. And what do you want to get out of this ride? And let's light the candles. And on the one hand, I think if that's where people are finding their spirituality, great, because people are craving a sense of connectedness, whether to each other, to their innermost selves, to a higher power, whatever it is. There's a lot of hunger for that right now. And the other part of me, again, as a rabbi, said, right, but there are all these wonderful faith traditions in the world. And like, what are we missing? And why here? Why in the spin studio and not in the house of worship?
It's a question that is driving Jaymee, in part, to step down from her full-time rabbi role to pursue Neshama more fully.
So I've been a congregational rabbi for 20 years. And at this time, I've decided to step aside from full-time congregational work and to pursue becoming a life coach and a personal trainer. And my hope is to really build a practice for people who want to bring that psycho-emotional, I imagine some spiritual component together with the physical. I know for me, when I train with the trainer, oftentimes they become sort of pseudo-therapy sessions and things come out of my mouth that I can't believe I'm sharing with a personal trainer. And I realize I'm not alone in that. I've spoken with enough trainers to know that that is often the case. And again, I think there's something about moving our bodies that opens up our minds as well. And so I'd like to be really intentional in building a business that does exactly that and lets people know it's okay.
This impulse to divulge, confide, even revere fitness instructors certainly extends to SoulCycle and other organizations. And while, as a rabbi, Jaymee has training in pastoral counseling that helps her guide people, Casper says most instructors don't, and that can cause problems.
This was one of the biggest conclusions from the work that we did, was that leaders of communities that were ostensibly about fitness, or in different spaces about creativity, for example, or about, nature, because that community became so important to the members, this was the place that they wanted to mark significant life transitions. The leaders of those communities were then being asked to do things that they had no training for or experience in. But at the same time, they didn't want to just say no. So whether it was officiating a wedding, whether it was hosting a going away party, all sorts of things, from the kind of small and easy to the more significant, counseling someone during a divorce or the death or diagnosis of a loved one, they would show up and talk about that with their fitness trainer. It can go wrong quickly. I was speaking with a wonderful woman who works for a Jewish denomination, talking about this example of someone going to a SoulCycle instructor and asking them to officiate the wedding. And she responded, she was like, oh God. And then within 2 seconds, she said, we should be training these SoulCycle instructors. And I was like, you know what? You're absolutely right.
The body is a temple, so many religions say. Yes, that can mean we should take care of our bodies, keep them healthy and well. But a temple is also a place of worship. And what we're seeing here is that our bodies can be a vehicle of sorts to the spiritual. A tool that, through its motions and biological responses, allows us to find greater connection to each other, and, if we're so inclined, to something greater. People have arrived at this realization in all sorts of ways. For some people of faith, it's part of a practice. For many secular folks, it's a novel way that's cracking open the door to spirituality, whether or not they ever intended it to. As Casper, Jaymee, and Emma all agree, there is a desire, a need out there for those 3 B's: belonging, becoming, and beyond. But exactly what role exercise will play in meeting those needs is still evolving. Maybe more religious leaders will use fitness programs as a way to support the physical and spiritual health of their congregations. Perhaps they'll act as advisors for fitness programs to help secular instructors better manage their clients' requests and expectations. Or maybe, like Jaymee, those 2 worlds will blend for some. Whatever form it takes, my bet is on continued integration of fitness and religion. In a country like the US, where many are focused on living better, healthier lives, the combo of physical and spiritual growth is a compelling one, and one that, if traditional faiths aren't open to it, might start to attract more and more of their congregants to spinning and lifting, rather than sitting and kneeling. That's it for Season 4 of How God Works. Thanks for taking the journey with us. We're going to take a little break for the summer, but we'll be back in late September with more. In the meantime, be in touch. If you have questions, ideas, comments, concerns, you can reach us via the show website, howgodworks, all one word, .org. There you can also listen to past episodes and find transcripts. You can also follow me on Twitter, @DavidDeSteno. I hope you have a great summer, and we'll see you in the fall for Season 5. How God Works is hosted and written by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman, our producer is Sophie Eisenberg, and executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Melissa Streifert is our intern. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. If you want to learn more, you can follow me on Twitter @DavidDeSteno.